There we go.
Welcome,
All right, we're
everybody.
live. The five horsemen here to chat about blood flow restriction training today. And I think the biggest things that we want to focus on are, does it work? Like, is the outcome there? Because I think that a lot of times when we start diving into research and literature, you can really get lost in the weeds. And so I always want to start with, like, what is the outcome or effect of this stimuli? And is there a positive outcome or effect that we are seeing? Research will then spend a lot of time trying to figure out why this thing gets the outcome. Like, that's mechanistic based research, which is very complex and very unclear. And then I want to focus on, does it give you significant differences versus just doing like normal training? Like, is it worth adding to your training? What is it doing that just good training without BFR won't bring to the table for you? And like, what are some protocols and practice and ways in which we can do this, right? And I think one of the things that was actually funny in this when I was reading, we'll post some links to like review papers and anything that we cite in the show notes here today. But yeah, I just want to try about, is this something that you should consider using in your training? If so, how, why, what should it look like? Because I think it's a question I still get. Like, someone actually asked me about that the other day. Like, one of my athletes was like, hey, dude, like, what do you think of this blood flow restriction stuff? Like, Chris Hemsworth says he does it and gets jacked for Thor. It's like, okay, fair question. But let's start here. Let's just start with, like, what is blood flow restriction training? And I will defer to Mr. Wilson because you're the only human I know who travels and always has, you always have a blood flow restriction training device on you at all times. And so I will let you kick off. Like, let's just first define this thing. Like, what is it?
Yeah, that's not an exaggeration at all. I bring those fucking things with me everywhere. Like, I bring them with me when I go to visit my mom, just in case she wants to get jacked on the trip, like Thor. So when I first heard about it was probably back in like 2010 or something like that. I think Lane Norton was talking about it. And at that time, everyone was just wrapping elastic bands around their arms. And I did that, of course. And that worked to an extent, actually. I think that in terms of the effect that I was going for, which is mostly just discomfort. But there's been a bunch of advances since then. They've definitely become easier to get a hold of. They've become cheaper. They're still ridiculously expensive for what it actually is. If you want to get like a real pump and be able to know and monitor how much pressure you're keeping in the cuff and make it more educated than just, do my fingers turn blue, yes or no? So there's a better way to do it now, which is cool. So and I can kind of let people know what I have. I mean, I have the H+ cuffs. I don't know. Those seem to work just fine. They're like the mid-range ones. Yeah. In terms of price. But so what is it doing? Well, basically what we're trying to do is just occlude the arteries to some degree. Or, I'm sorry, not the arteries. We're really trying to occlude the venous flow. Yeah. And we're still trying to keep arterial flow into a degree. And now, the question is, like, do you need to do that? Do you need cuffs to do that? The first thing I think to understand is that we're always doing that when we're doing weight training with a sufficient load and a sufficient intensity. We're going to get restriction of those blood vessels, and we're going to restrict oxygen flow and CO2 flow out to a degree. So that's like the important thing first. And then it becomes, in my mind, more of like a practical discussion of like, when is it useful and is it useful? But just based off of what, and of course, I'm going to approach this from my hypertrophy perspective, like I do everything in my life. And, one of the things that we need for hypertrophy is like, we're going to need sufficient tension, and we can probably get some secondary effects potentially, or just like indirect effects with like cell swelling and some of these like metabolites that are produced and this low oxygen state at the local tissue. And we're definitely going to get all of those things with some type of blood flow restriction. We're going to get the tension more in like an indirect way, because we're going to end up fatiguing out a lot of those lower threshold motor units because they're deprived of oxygen essentially. And then we're going to have to start recruiting the higher threshold motor units as we continue to carry out that exercise. So we're getting that mechanical tension in that sense. And then we're most definitely getting this like reperfusion and cell swelling effect, which is I think been noted to have an effect on hypertrophy in itself, just with that that reperfusion of blood and what that does at the cellular level, and the signaling pathways associated with that. So we're kind of getting all of those things with this, but again, the question is like, do we actually need to go out and do I need to travel around with blood flow restriction cuffs every time I go to see my mother in order to actually get hypertrophy?
Yeah. I think to summarize that up, really what we're doing here, like we're taking some type of device and wrapping it around the proximal portion of your limbs, either your arms or your legs, right? And we intentionally wrap
proximal,
the most proximal thing we can get to. And if you have a cuff, you're going to inflate that cuff. If you have bands or something else, you're just going to tie them pretty tight. And we're getting a little bit of arterial inflow. We don't want to block that entirely. So you're going to have a little bit of arterial inflow. But the thing that you're blocking is the venous outflow. And so when we think about hypertrophy, we know this exists on a spectrum, and there are different ways to drive muscle hypertrophy, right? We have metabolic stress, which is the accumulation of metabolic byproducts that build up in the local environment as you train. Things like hydrogen ions, so we get pH change. Like there's a ton of things that build up there. And so if you block the venous outflow, and I'm not really bringing in much in terms of arterial, it's like a trickle, then you have a very non-oxidative acidic environment where all these things are really going to start to build up, right? So you're taking this metabolic stress factor and really jacking it up significantly higher potentially, right? And then we also know we have tension, maybe like damage, cell swelling, et cetera. But I think the thought originally with blood flow restriction training was maybe this is just like an easy backdoor way into getting more hypertrophy than we would otherwise, right? And
with really low loads.
With really low loads, right? We're talking like 20 to 50% of your, like, air quote, like 1 rep max type loads, okay? And so I think that if we were to start with the first question here, which is, like, does it actually work? Like, that's, I think, the question that always matters. I think everyone wants to go to, okay, well, why is this thing doing this thing? But the first question that matters is, does it actually work? Is there something here? Is there significant evidence that shows that this is doing something positive repeatedly, right? And I think that there is. And so what's interesting, though, is if we look at it, I think that you end up getting really similar outcomes and changes with regards to hypertrophy. Like if you do what we would consider more traditional hypertrophy training without BFR, and then you did the BFR approach where you went lower loads and higher reps and all that other stuff, it looks like the outcome with regards to hypertrophy is not really that different. They're very similar, right? Let's maybe start there and see if that rings true to everyone else, kind of based off of, you know, the reviews and things that we've read here. It looks like from a hypertrophy standpoint, we're pretty similar. It's like you can either go heavier load, 8 to 12 reps, whatever it is, or you go lighter load with BFR and you're going to get about the same hypertrophy outcome. Is kind of what it looks like here. Is that a pretty fair statement?
I would say so, yeah.
Cool. Maybe.
Maybe.
My question is, so when I think about hypertrophy, I think about it in two different ways. I think about hypertrophy of the myofibrils and then hypertrophy of the surrounding fluid, so sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. I would think BFR stuff would be almost exclusively sarcoplasmic hypertrophy because of the cellular changes and fatigue that you're learning to deal with. And so if you're coming off of a training cycle where you're doing heavier, quote, heavier strength stuff, where you're training, 6 to maybe 10 reps, instead of 8 to 15 reps. Like both of those are right in the wheelhouse of getting really good tension stimuli. But if I'm coming off of a myofibril heavier thing, I'm probably going to see, I would hypothesize at least that I would see more out of blood flow restriction stuff. And if I only did blood flow restriction stuff, I might hit this point of diminishing returns. Just like anything, it would be something to periodize. Does that ring true to any of y'all's experience?
Yeah, are we trying to keep this like under 3 hours?
So I've never used it. And I had a professor in college right around the time you said 2010, he had just gotten back from Japan over the summer, and he had studied with the Katsu stuff. My understanding with blood flow restriction stuff is that it's important to keep the pressure of the resistance or the cuff, we'll say to simplify it, pretty standard so that it doesn't change too much, though I imagine that might not matter all that much. And it sounds like you get the more expensive system instead of wrapping a band around your upper arm just in order to do something like that. Is that true?
Yeah, I think if you have access to those cuffs, that's going to be a much more accurate. So Katsu was like the first person doing, and I think at that time it wasn't even blood flow restriction. They were just calling it occlusion training, because I think that they were occluding both arterial and venous flow.
Oh, really?
So I think is that right, James? Is that I feel like
I would have to go back and read that. I think that if you look at,
because that was like the 50 or something.
Yeah, if you look across, I think the time scope of all of the literature, you have a pretty wide range with regards to the protocol being used with like how much this thing is being inflated. Because like in a lab setting like that, like in the lab that we had, we would totally stop arterial inflow. I mean, we weren't doing blood flow restriction training. But like you would look at things like flow mediated dilation, which basically like you throw a Doppler on a brachial artery, and you put a pump on here and you inflate it to suprasystolic blood pressures, and you totally stop all flow coming in. And you can see it on the Doppler, like there's literally zero flow. And you watch the artery start to expand because it's trying to be like, hey bro, like I need some bloods and oxygens, like hook me up. And so you literally watch this thing on the Doppler start to get bigger. And then you let the cuff off and you get this massive inflow of flow, and that artery just like explodes. It dilates like crazy. In a healthy population, at least, like you look at how much it changes, and that's a pretty good indicator of like cardiovascular health. But yeah, so you have like in lab settings, they just like, you just like, tap a number on a thing and hit a button and just like, you get no arterial inflow. That's not really, I think, what we're going for here with the blood flow restriction training. You're gonna have a little bit of, you're really just trying to block the venous, and like the venous pressure is pretty low compared to the arterial pressure.
So what is your cuff at, like 80, 90 then?
So what I've been doing, or what I've read recently, is more that you're going to pump it up until you get arterial restriction, and you'll know that you have that by losing that. If you have a Doppler unit, like you'll lose that pulse, and then you're going to do a percentage from there. And I think that can be a pretty wide range. So say it takes you, you pump it up to 200 millimeters of mercury, and that's when you restrict flow. Then you're going to take like maybe up to 70-80% of that, and then that just kind of becomes your number, and you're going to keep that on throughout the entire protocol. And then when you release it, you're going to get that reperfusion of blood. Just that like shearing force against with those arteries coming through, like that might be hypertrophic just in itself. And I think that's probably why we see some amount of hypertrophy in people that just put in, like in bed rest, like they'll just put cuffs on people for 10 minutes or whatever and release them, and they have less muscle loss during that period. I would guess that it has something to do with that, along with just the metabolite production, because the question about like the sarcoplasmic versus myofibrillar, like I look at sarcoplasmic as, and this may be inaccurate, but this is just kind of how I've constructed in my mind, is like I think of the sarcoplasmic stuff as being more energy related, as it's going to be more like glycogen and glycolytic enzymes, and maybe even like sarcoplasmic reticulums and that type of stuff. That might be getting more into like the myofibrillar side at that point, I suppose. And then like the myofibrillar adaptations are probably coming more from tension based stuff. And when you're like bedridden, you kind of have neither one of those things happening. Like there isn't like a ton of energetic stress, and there isn't a ton of tension, but there is probably this like reperfusion effect. So yeah, I mean, to answer that, like the initial question, I believe that to be the case. Like I think that there probably is more of like, when I program it in for myself personally, I'm thinking of it like as like a more of a metabolic stressor, and I'm getting some indirect myofibrillar stress for sure, because I am having to recruit those higher threshold motor units. But I think like the energetic demand is probably higher than that, but I don't have any way to prove that whatsoever. That's just kind of how
just how you would
I don't
think
think
about
that literature really exists.
I don't know.
Go ahead.
I was gonna say, I'm not aware of any literature that's parsed out whether or not it's coming from this more sarcoplasmic or myofibrillar approach for hypertrophy. And for people listening, if those two words are like, what the fuck does that mean? We're basically just saying, like, are you adding more muscle fibers, or are you just putting more fluid into like the muscle itself, right? And I'm not aware of any, and I could be wrong, right? Because I haven't spent like a ton of time on PubMed really trying to go ham on this. I'm not aware of the differences, but I think as a potential mechanism, something that could be a counter argument to that is like one way that they think blood flow restriction training is working is like the fact that I'm not really getting much oxygen in. Yeah. And you have group 3 and 4 afferents that feed back to the brain that start shutting down these slow twitch muscle fibers. They fatigue faster. So you start typing into these higher motor units quicker. And so if that's the case, and I'm using the higher end motor units more, then like you could potentially be getting like some of that myofibrillar hypertrophy from that. But I would think that if you asked me to like have to sit down and like make a bet on like which of the two do I think is probably contributing more.
They don't have that Google Fiber and Knoxville.
They don't. I was going to say the same thing though. I thought the same thing that James was saying, like, you know, and just based on what you said, Ryan.
But if that right now is being proposed as a potential mechanism, then I could see it having a myofibrillar approach because you're recruiting those higher end motor units that we know have capacity to have more of that type of response. But if I was going to have to make a bet, I would probably bet on the side of more of the sarcoplasmic, just because when I think about the metabolic stress side of the coin, that's where my brain goes. And so, like, I'm sure you're probably getting both, right?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I don't think you can ever separate them.
It's probably just like a dimmer switch. It's like maybe you're getting like a 70-30, 60-40 split off of it. Sure. And I don't really know. I don't think anybody does, or no one can probably say that with enough confidence. But yeah, because I think one of the studies here, it was like Lowry et al. In 2013. Ryan, this one's right up your alley. They were doing heavy bicep curls.
Yeah,
I've heard of them.
And so they basically had two groups. They had a group, like they took a baseline for biceps brachii muscle thickness. They took a baseline measure. And then for the first 4 weeks, half of the group was doing blood flow restriction training. Half of the group was doing like what we would consider normal hypertrophy training. And then they remeasured. And then for the second 4 weeks, so 8 weeks in total, they flipped the groups. So one group went blood flow restriction to just like traditional higher intensity. And then the other group went higher intensity to then going to blood flow restriction. And both groups saw significant improvements in biceps brachii muscle thickness compared to baseline. But there's no difference between the two groups at either metric at 4 weeks or 8 weeks. And so that's like some of the evidence that's looking to the fact that, hey, like both of these things work. They're both driving hypertrophy in one way or another. But it doesn't look like there's not a significant difference between the two approaches. Yeah. I think that's kind of an important thing for people to realize or understand. Like, it's just another tool. It's just another way for us to help drive hypertrophy, right? Because a lot of the people doing this research, like you're trying to figure out how to take people who don't like to lift and don't want to have to lift heavy weight and don't have to suffer. It's like, how can you do this and not have to?
Yeah.
Huh? Yeah.
Or they can't because of an injury or some type of thing that's preventing them from doing that. That's where I found it to be incredibly useful. And I think this is probably where like Kieran and Ryan Patrick could chime in, because you're going to have athletes that are injured. And like, what do you do when you still want to get a training effect? Like, this might be a reasonable option.
Yeah. I'll throw in just like two things here super quick. No, go ahead, Kieran. Sorry.
Oh, no. I was going to say, now that I'm outside, I have a brief window of no planes flying overhead. I'm also next to a local airport. It's just like, pick the worst spot today. But
your internet still works better than mine.
To your point about, I think that's probably the biggest use for it is that return to play scenario where, like, we got a couple of cross guys who just wrapped up the championship and they've been kind of playing injured the whole time, and now you see them all in like the boots and things like that where they're out for probably most of the summer. So now we start having these conversations with some of our athletic trainers about like, how do we continue to work through the summer and try to keep as much of the strength and hypertrophy as we can. And I think that's a great way to start to implement it, right? Just super simple stuff like that.
Ryan, Patrick, you have anything to add?
No, I don't. On top of that, I mean, the BFR admittedly is not my wheelhouse. So, some of the things that I would probably encourage us to touch on would be, kind of the pragmatic standpoint in terms of implementation. Mm-hmm. So I know we'll probably dive into that before the end of the pod, but to the point, like, especially with athletes, they're not just, cleared from physical therapy is one thing when they're able to train, but a lot of these athletes have a very short window in terms of them getting back to top tier performance. And we're talking about the highest force outputs. We're talking about, extreme velocities and force through those tissues. So if there is a way that we can manage that or at least mitigate some of the downtime and the atrophy, because I mean, disuse, especially, when we talk about somebody in a hospital bed, even just the ability to walk around and move retains so much more muscle mass. But when somebody is isolating a limb or they're completely immobilizing it, that atrophies so quickly. And it just makes, then you're trying to balance two things. You're trying to bring one side up and still bridge that gap to performance. So I think over time, there's going to be a lot of utility with this. And, now it's definitely got me a lot more interested in how we can use that.
I haven't used it a whole lot to, as a part of my prescribed training protocol. But if somebody has something, like I've got a Rebel client who's got them, I'm like, this is a great way for you to add some volume without wearing down your system so much. You'll still get that, this sucks feeling that will give you some sort of good stimulus. And the other use case that I thought of was, I had a guy that I trained at Google who could not bend his knees, like could not do squats. He could do all of those things, and he probably wasn't quite as bad as he felt like he was, but he's just like, my knees are bad and I can't do this. So it was really hard to convince him to train quads, and something like this would be much easier. I might even be able to get him to do some body weight stuff, give him an annoyingly long set, I think, but you could get some stimulus.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think in the rehab part, we kind of have to like bucket this, right? I think there are two ways we can have this conversation. It's using blood flow restriction in more of a rehab setting, and then there's trying to use it in a performance setting. I think we have to try to categorize it in one of those two worlds. And it's like, okay, well, in the rehab setting, yeah, like we do have some pretty positive evidence in the literature, right? Because you have stuff like showing that not even exercising, like just throwing, like Ryan, you mentioned this already, just throwing an occlusion cuff on for 5 minutes without exercise significantly decreased muscle atrophy of both quads and hamstrings and post-operative ACL reconstruction. That's pretty sweet. Like you literally aren't doing anything. You have an immobilized limb and all I have to do is put a cuff on and occlude you for 5 minutes a couple of times and you're going to lose way less muscle. That's pretty cool, right? And then you have stuff where you do like low load BFR training, got muscle and strength back faster in like a post ACL reconstruction environment as well. And so I think there's definitely tons of support here on that rehab side of the world. Like it seems like a total no-brainer. Like if you're injured, if you're coming back, if like you can't go chase load for some reason, it's like, it just seems like a totally obvious low-hanging fruit. Like why is everyone not doing this in that setting? But then if we go to like the performance setting, I think we've addressed the fact that it's another option for us to drive hypertrophy, but it doesn't look like it's going to be any better or worse than what would be more like traditional higher load hypertrophy training. Because at the end of the day, like the metric that probably matters the most for hypertrophy is just like the number of sets you do that suck. That's like a really rough cursory, right? That's probably the greatest predictor of hypertrophy we have. The number of total sets you do that suck, that are at an 8 RPE or above, are probably our greatest predictor.
The intended tissue.
Yes, with loading the intended tissue. That's an important, very important aspect.
That's where I think the BFR can be really useful. So the traditional BFR protocol that you'll see in the majority of the research, and now people are starting to get a little bit crazier, which is super fun to watch. But the traditional protocol was like take 30% of your 1 RM of your leg extension and hit like 30 reps to start, take a 30-second rest, hit 15 reps, 30-second rest, 15 reps, 30-second rest, 15 reps, right? That's the traditional protocol?
Yeah,
right?
that's the protocol.
So, okay, so that's cool, but like who can't do a leg extension? I mean, like pretty much everyone can do a leg extension, and you can do that with heavier weight or lighter weight or whatever. And I think it's going to be a very similar response. I think the major thing that's changing during that protocol is that you don't get that kind of reprieve in between sets. Like it's almost worse in between sets if you've ever done this protocol before.
It's pretty terrible.
It's so terrible. I love it.
We did it when I came down to Austin that first time. It was like, dude, James, I'm so happy you're here, man. You want to go in the back where I have a leg extension machine? And I'm going to occlude you and let's see how long you can last. I'm like, yeah, dude, why not? Let's do it.
Yeah, it's just so fun. I love taking people through it because it's like the first set, they're always like, oh, yeah, this is cool. It's like 30 reps. Like, who wants to do 30 reps? And then you finish and you're like, oh, God, like this is not going away. This feeling is not going away. And then it gets like, it kind of freaks people out, which I think is pretty cool for a lot of reasons. But so that, but in my mind, on the leg extension, like that's cool. That may be pushing us further than we would normally be able to go. And on a leg extension, you could definitely make the argument that it's a little bit of a weird pull on the ACL potentially. I don't know if people still like really believe that to be the case, but I could see that. Like if you're trying to like really mash leg extensions, at some point that could not feel good. But I think where it could actually really be interesting is with exercises where because when you do a leg extension, your quads are the limiting factor. Like it's never like your back or something, right? But a lot of our lower body exercises, it is something else that's the limiting factor. Like if we think of a squat, like it's typically not just the quads that are the limiter there. It's like they have to just holding the position is a limiter, holding the position or holding the thorax and pelvis in a way that the quads can actually work really hard. That becomes the hardest part of the squat. So I might be able to squat, 405 for 10 reps, but like the main thing that's which I can't, by the way. The main thing that's limiting me is just being able to hold the position. Like my quads are kind of like, they've been done since like, rep 3 or whatever. Like they're not even able to really work that hard because I'm having to leverage my hips at this point. So using something like BFR in a squat could be really cool, because now you can reduce the load a ton to the point where holding the position is actually pretty easy. Like you could do that with 135, but now your quads are just getting no rest at any point in time. And I've done that. I have protocols that I've used with squats with BFR that are just so gnarly. At least from like what we're looking for in the acute sense, it's like that feeling of working really hard and like the local tissue working really hard and not getting a bunch of accessory muscles and discomfort in other places. Like, yeah, I think that can be really, really cool. So that's something I've used myself a lot personally, especially when I've had like issues with other things where I couldn't load, like if my back was fucked up or I had any other thing going on. That's been really useful.
I think one of the things in the performance realm here to tack on to that, when we start talking about our big lifts, this was actually surprising to me because I wasn't fully expecting this. I remember when I first started thinking about blood flow restriction a while ago, like with the way the literature sits right now, if you actually look at trained populations, because that you have to like always take that in consideration. Like what population are they studying? Like are we training, is this like well-trained people, untrained people, sick people, bedridden people? Like that always totally changes the game. But if you look at a trained population, the place where blood flow restriction looks to actually have the biggest impact is on strength, which is super interesting. Like there's a pretty substantial amount of evidence that shows that if you do your, when you add blood flow restriction to your heavy training, you see significant improvements in strength and squat and bench in particular. No one's really looked at deadlift because it would be kind of a awkward thing to look at, I think. But in the research, a lot of people have looked at squat and bench, and you see that like they'll do their typical, like, say they'll do like 3 sets of 5 of like typical heavy lifting in a big compound movement. And then they'll hit back off sets with blood flow restriction. like a group will hit back off sets with blood flow restriction. Another group will hit the same back off sets with no blood flow restriction. So you at least are equating for like total work and volume. And then you have a control group that's doing no back off sets, right? And like you see pretty consistently that there's at least a statistically significant improvement in strength in like a 3 or a 5 rep max, for example, or even a 1 rep max in squat and bench in the group that does back off sets with blood flow restriction versus the group that doesn't, or the group that does no back off sets. And like and we can link to all these. Like you have like Cook from 2013 showed something like that. Lubers in 2014, blah, blah, blah. I'm trying to like keep all my stuff over here in my iPad organized. Yeah, we'll link to a lot of these, but like that evidence is pretty substantial, which I thought was super interesting. And that's like the way that I think about it and the way that I've seen it referenced that I like is it's kind of like free training volume, because you're not going to get the like really big muscle damage. You're not going to have that crazy soreness the next few days. It's just like low hanging fruit free volume for people, which is
it depends
intriguing.
on how you do it.
Yeah, I mean, no, it's gonna suck. Don't get me wrong, but like I think that hitting back off sets at say 30%,
systemic fatigue is lower.
Yeah, hitting back off sets at say 30% versus like doing more like very high end work. It's like, yeah, I thought that was super intriguing that you consistently see strength improvements across the board. And so from a performance standpoint, it's like, okay, like maybe that's a tool worth like really considering using during different phases of training. It's like, if we do say like an EDM protocol, for example, with that estimated daily max, it's like, cool, maybe I'm going to do my EDM to my top set normal, and then I'm going to hit my back off sets with blood flow restriction. Or like half the back off sets will be BFR, half won't. But like that's where it looks to be like the best tool is improving strength.
Yeah, I mean, my first question would just be, I would want to know what the proximity to the final testing day was, like, because it's possible that they could just be carrying more fatigue in general going into the retest. But I would imagine that they probably, I haven't looked into those ones. I probably have at some point. It's just been a really long time.
Yeah.
But that would be my first question. But I think, yeah, you could definitely, I think at the very least, like for where we're at right now, it seems that it's not going to be any worse. So, and if it's definitely, see, like when I've done these protocols or I've had people do them, it's like, it's so terrible, like while you're doing it, but it's like to your point, like you're not carrying a ton of fatigue afterwards. Like, I mean, you'll get sore from it, like the first few times you do it, but it's not the same as doing, like another 5 sets of regular squats in terms of what that's going to do to the rest of your body.
Yeah.
And just your whole system. The blood flow can be like, the blood restriction stuff can just be a nice way of really training hard in that moment, but then not carrying so much of that with you for the rest of the session or for the rest of the week. And I think there's a ton of value in that.
I think that's going to have a lot of value for the athletes too, because they've got so many competing commitments in terms of where they have to allocate their output. So if we can get something that doesn't have a huge systemic load, but provides the effect that we want, I think that's going to be really valuable for somebody who's got to do, running and competition and sport practice.
That can make a lot of sense for in-season folks, dude. Like maintenance, like that's the first place my mind goes in this category. Like you got any competitive athlete that's in season, like that seems like a really nice way to maybe like maintain and hold on to things without them having to touch higher end loads potentially.
Yeah, very low cost.
This is kind of random, but I always think of the old school bodybuilders. They kind of seem to have found the fountain of youth with some of the higher rep traditional training where they're really focusing on the muscles. I think part of it is they're just not destroying themselves with weight all the time. And this could be another way that kind of enhances that effect. So I think about, if you can get the same ROI and you have a periodized cycle where maybe you're doing BFR for 8 or 12 weeks, and you're using lower loads, there's got to be some benefit in terms of joint stress or, just overall, kind of Ryan, to your point, that systemic fatigue that I think just really beats people up over time.
Yeah, I would very much agree with that.
Absolutely. Yeah. And if you guys are cool with going to a place that has zero evidence supporting literature at all, like I can give a few anecdotes.
Yeah, I love anecdotal evidence.
Yeah.
Anecdotal evidence is a leading indicator, dude. Research happens because enough people have anecdotal evidence.
Yeah, fair, right? Like, so the way that I've utilized it a lot of times is in people, and I guess this would be kind of more like rehabby type of settings, I suppose, in a sense. Um, but I mean, I'll use myself as an example. Like the two times that I've really utilized it a ton was because I couldn't squat anymore. I was having like this issue where like my lateral quad was probably just from doing like really like, powerlifting style squats where you end up rolling on the outsides of your feet and really biasing a lot of that lateral quad tissue. And they would just get to the point where like it was so painful, it just felt like it was just gonna pop. And I've actually had times where like little like I would feel like a pop. And it's like, oh wow, now I can't like bend my knees anymore. Like this really sucks. So I had periods, like I had a period of time where like I couldn't squat for like 9 months. I couldn't do any like real direct quad training, and that was the thing that got me back into it. And I think that when you have an injury, there is like the initial, maybe there is some type of physical damage that actually takes place. Like maybe you do tear a muscle, right? But eventually that thing, whether it's through surgery or just kind of on its own, it kind of repairs itself or things work around. I don't know exactly what goes on, but it gets better. But you might still have the pain. And a lot of that pain at that point is just really your brain holding on to that memory of that injury. It's protecting itself from injuring that area again, but there might not actually be anything wrong with that tissue at this point. So after 9 months of having this like ping in my quad, it's like I don't think there's anything really going on there anymore. As far like there's no bruising, there's no swelling, there's nothing like that appears to be wrong, but I still can't do this thing. So using the blood flow restriction, I in my mind was kind of the only thing that I could do. But I think what it did is it just created a more immediate threat for my brain than this memory of this painful thing. And so it's like, you take away the majority of the oxygen at the tissue. And James, you said this plenty of times, like that's going to send off some alarms. Like you're going to have those afferent signaling going back.
It's like the biggest alarm signal.
Yeah, like that's the problem. Like you're going to focus on that, like that. So it makes it very difficult to think about this other thing. And it's like, as you're doing these reps, it's like, wow, I really don't feel this lateral quad thing anymore. Now I just feel like what I like feeling when I train. And it just reinforces that like, this is this thing that you can actually do and it doesn't hurt and you enjoy it again. And you're getting at the same time, this kind of endorphin and catecholamine release. And that would be my theory of why it works so well. And I've used this with plenty of people with like knee pain or back pain. And that's kind of the intervention. It's like, I don't really think there's anything wrong with your back. I just think every time that you do a squat, because we fixed the squat, like the squat looks good. And there's nothing apparently wrong with your back. It's just that every time you do it, it hurts. So let's just provide a completely different stimulus and threat that's way more immediate. And all of a sudden they start doing this squat again and reinforcing it with a ton of reps. And then it's like, they're off to the races. And at the same time, they're still getting some hypertrophy and probably some strength along with that. So I found it incredibly useful for that. I think it's probably more useful for lower body than it is for upper body for that reason, because you're usually not like super limited upper body wise with positions and all of that stuff. But I don't know. That's just my anecdote and why I'm unofficially a salesman for these BFR cuffs.
Nice, guys. Well, this was good. Let's kind of recap this, I think, and maybe give like the big takeaways for people listening. So I think that 3 big takeaways here on the first question, like, does it work? Is there an outcome here that's even significant? And the answer to that question is yes. And I think it happens in 3 domains. I think 1, it looks to be about as effective as more traditional heavier load hypertrophy training, but it's not going to be any better, right? It looks to be about on the same plane, about as effective. It does look like it creates a significant improvement when added to strength training. So if you have like your heavier sets of strength training and you add back off sets with BFR, you are seeing significant improvements in squat and bench strength, which I think is super intriguing. And then go ahead.
Just a quick question on that. Do you have the protocol right there of what they did for the back off sets? I'm just curious how many reps they were doing, because I don't think they were doing the 30, 15, 15, 15.
It was not 30, 15, 15, 15, but I'll have to send it to you.
And I don't think you need to. Yeah.
No.
Okay, fine.
No, I'll pull it up here and I'll send it to you afterwards. Cool. I don't remember. But yeah, we'll link to all of that in the show notes if people want to like really dive in and go look at the specific protocols. But yeah, I can show that to you once we're off air here. And then I think thing number 3 is that it definitely has great application in this more rehabby setting, where if we have a pain issue, if we have an injury issue, there's some, like we can't train traditionally, then it's like the occlusion is playing a huge role in decreasing atrophy, which means that return to play is going to happen significantly faster, right? Or in the anecdotal evidence, using it if I have some pain of some kind to continue to train and get me to a point to be able to do this thing again, pain-free, baby. Right. So I think those are the 3 big avenues where we see like, hey, this thing's definitely working. In terms of mechanisms, why is this thing working? Who really knows? There's like 8 to 10 different hypotheses of why this could be working. It's probably a combination of all of them. It's like metabolic stress, recruitment of type 2 fibers, growth hormone stuff, obviously like mTOR is somewhere in here. We're changing signaling pathways, and it's like cell swelling. Who knows? Probably some combination of all of these factors. And yeah, I just don't, the mechanism stuff gets super, super interesting, but it's like, it's not going to change what I practice or what I do. So, okay. And then I think that from like a protocol standpoint, yeah, you got to dig into the research a little bit. The most classic protocol is that 30, 15, 15, 15. And again, I'll have to pull up the ones on the strength studies. I don't remember what they were off the top of my head. I read those this morning actually. And yeah, it's kind of all I got here. So it's worthwhile. Consider adding it to your training with the 3 things that we have mentioned. Yeah, did I miss anything?
So Monday, I want to walk in and I'm like, this all sounds pretty cool. I don't have the Katsu cuffs, but I just want to play around with this. Practically, would you be like, hit a drop set of bicep curls at the end of Monday's workout and just like, use some knee wraps to like a 6 out of 10 pressure, or like how would you approach somebody's first time messing around with it?
I would say if you're using it in a training setting from a liability standpoint, I probably wouldn't mess around too much with the wraps. I don't know if there was in that review they were talking about potentially doing something where you can base it off of like the discoloration of the hands, and if it's like if you get the response you're looking for, then I don't know that I'd mess around with that too much. You could also, if you had access to an ultrasound or even a stethoscope or something, you could take that brachiordy and then reduce from there, just so it's not like completely random. They do also make like wraps that have like numbers on them, so you can at least somewhat keep it the same. But I don't know. I think the better way to get that is like you can still do blood flow restriction training. Like you're always doing blood flow restriction training when you're doing hypertrophy training. So what I would do is just use a similar protocol and then just go to like, don't go to full muscle lengths. So if like you're doing a bicep curl, maybe just don't go all the way down to the point where you're getting any kind of relaxation at the bottom. And you could use some type of like drop set like that and just keep tension on the muscle the whole time. Just keep it like in that mid range. And I think you're going to get like a similar feeling effect like from that. And I don't know if it's going to be the same outcome, but that's probably how I would use that. I don't know, James, do you have any ideas on that?
I think it's a little janky sometimes. That's kind of tough. It's like, I don't know. You kind of really
I've done it.
Oh yeah. I would do it for myself, but like you got to really, from like a coaching standpoint, like you got to really be tight with whoever you're going to do this with. Cause you could like bruise the piss out of like, there's some places where that may not go so well. So probably try to find some cuffs or things you can inflate that are not going to like rip skin and like leave you terribly bruised and like torn apart. But yeah, if you could definitely like jerry rig it together potentially. Like I'm not going to maybe recommend you do that, but like you can use knee sleeves, wraps, etc. And just get stuff tight wrapped around a limb. Like it's going to be doing something.
It'll work, yeah.
I mean, I think the only other thing to mention here is, and we haven't said this just because it's not really the people that listen to this or our population, The only time I think that you have to keep an eye on the blood flow restriction type stuff, like anything, is when you have compromised populations, right? If you have people that have like some type of cardiovascular disease, if there are heart concerns and issues there, not really who we work with, not the people that listen to this. I'm just going to throw that in there as an asterisk anyways. Like, know your population. Like, a high risk population is a high risk population. Like, training for them is probably a risk. So we just got to keep that in mind, like, and know yourself. Like, if you're hypertensive and you have really high blood pressure, this is something that you definitely want to go chat with the doctor about before you start using, because you're going to get a big exercise pressor reflex and all this other stuff happening. So yeah, like, if you happen to fall in one of those buckets, like, do your homework, go talk to a doctor. But for all the healthy folk listening, which is going to be probably 99.9% of you, I don't like, there's nothing I see here from a health concern standpoint that would keep me from having anyone do it, other than just having access to something to do it. That's not going to be like wrapping a band around my arm and then I get like just like bad bruising or whatever it potentially would be from the implement used.
Yeah, I don't think there's like huge consequences, but it's just I just don't think you want to get yourself into any issues with working with clients or athletes.
All right, sweet. I hope everybody found this useful, found it helpful. We'll throw links to references and stuff like that in show notes. So if people want to go read that stuff and look into it more, they can. But yeah, that's all we got for you guys and gals this week. Hope you have a fantastic rest of your week, and we'll talk to you next Monday.
Cool. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.